Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail. Today we are going to share real demonic encounters, horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. I met a demon in my nightmares. I was never the same. Throughout my childhood, I would experience many nightmares. I always wondered what triggered them, and a peace of mind would believe that it was from the house that me and my family moved into. It was a pretty old house, made around the 1960s, and it always haunted me throughout the night. I could barely sleep at times, and at my young age, 7 years old, I would often panic and my heartbeat would race. I've had all sorts of nightmares. Clowns, getting murdered, feeling trapped in a place. But this one dream was something that I didn't expect. It was the usual Sunday night. Eating dinner, drinking some cold milk before bed, getting tucked in, the regular. I was anxious to go to sleep that night. It was dark, cold, and I felt all alone in my room as my parents talked in the room right across from the hallway. I drifted into a cold sleep after minutes of thinking. I was awakened, but yet I wasn't in my regular bed with my Mario sheets and cool pillow. Instead, I was in the dark. At this point, I began to panic. Several footsteps were coming from several locations, and I didn't know where this figure was going to appear. Suddenly, the footsteps ended, and I was in complete silence. I turned to my right, and I could see a red, shadowy light, and I couldn't determine what kind of figure it was. The red eyes began to glow, and suddenly, I could see a dark figure, blending in with the darkness. My mind began to scramble. "Get me out of here. Get me out of here," I began to say, hoping that maybe my mind could wake me up from this horrible nightmare. But yet, even with my pleading, I was still there. The face of the figure was completely dark, and all I could see were those red eyes. The mouth opened, and it began to smile, slowly and slowly, and as this was going on, I was panting and screaming, hoping that it would end, but it didn't. A ringing in my ears began to happen, and I could see a strange static that began to plague my eyesight. What could this be? I thought. A monster? A demon? I prayed every night before I went to bed. So why is this happening to me? The figure was in a straight position. Its head was tilted to the left, and I saw the following numbers that started to glow on its forehead: 666. It was then when I realized that I was making eye contact with a demon. "Jack," this strange entity said. I looked at them in horror. Their voice was mine? How could that be? It was my voice, but deeper and raspier. It was like my throat was closed shut. I couldn't say a single word to this entity because I was genuinely fearing for my life, even though I was in this dream state. Why is this happening to me? I thought. It just said my name. The small hairs on my little 7-year-old arms began to lift up as my entire body emerged in goosebumps. Suddenly, I began to levitate. I could barely move my body at all as this was happening. The only words that I could mutter from my throat was, "Stop," but yet it wouldn't. It felt like my soul was getting sucked out of my body, as if it was being taken away from me. My vision started to go black, and all I could hear were my own screams and the sound of ringing as this demon was taking my soul. It was pitch black, and suddenly, I woke up from the dream. It was morning, and I could hear my mother's footsteps as she approached my room. "Jack, you have school today. Get out of bed," she said. I didn't respond. The dream had terrified me so much to the point that I couldn't even get out of my bed. It took me a couple of minutes before I could leave the cold bed that I was in during that night. I did my morning routine, but everything felt odd. It was a feeling that I couldn't explain, and I knew that it had something to do with that dream. As I was taking off my pajamas and my Sonic shirt, I realized that an aching pain was coming from the left side of my belly. I couldn't get a look because it was too far to the left, so I decided to go up to my mirror to inspect what was causing this aching pain. But when I looked at that mirror, it was like my entire body had gone numb. A strange bruise had appeared on my belly. Second story. My personal encounter with nearly a dozen demons. Okay, so here goes. I live in Hawaii, not far from a graveyard in Makapu'u Point, a location said to be haunted by many locals. It is said that at this point, if your car stalls in the middle of the road at night, you are never seen again. I often see ambulances driving to this location late at night. Anyway, that's not about my haunting story, just showing there are others nearby. Here begins my story. I moved out to Hawaii about 2 years ago to go to college since I have family here. For many of the first months, I thought nothing of random cold chills that would run down my spine late at night, walking down my hall to go outside and smoke a cigarette. Even though my house is around mid-70s at night, often I would hear my grandmother telling me stories about how she couldn't sleep the night before because she would see wisps around 1 a.m. and would again feel cold chills, even though her AC would be off. For a while, though nothing of its sign, she thought it was just smoke from my hookah managing to somehow get to her room. But there was a problem. The smoke/wisp had no odor whatsoever, and it moved in a behavioral manner. One night I decided to stay up with her with an EVP that was able to translate various electromagnetic signals into text. Apparently this was a very, very bad idea. I got some interesting readings that night, but nothing too out of the ordinary. I returned to my room and went off to sleep. On the following weeks, I began to run my EVP monitor almost every night. I began to notice that there was steadily an increase in high-energy blimps around my room, and I would often feel chills. Then, again, nothing for weeks. Then one night, everything changed. I had my first experience with a demon, 10 to be exact, found out later with EVP. In the middle of the night, I was still awake, around 12:30. So I walked out into my house to get a drink before going outside for a smoke. My house was literally filled with wisps and smoke, and my grandmother was walking around silent, whispering, "Can you see them? They're here." I walked around the house for a while, but since I had become accustomed to the wisps, I thought nothing of it. I went outside for a smoke and came back in to notice the wisps had disappeared. Little did I realize that night was a full moon. I go back to sleep and begin having very odd and strange, graphic/gory dreams, something very, very rare for me. I was awoken around a little bit later with sleep paralysis, something that has never happened to me, and something that shouldn't since I have very good health other than my smoking habits. In my sleep paralysis, I was unable to talk or move. I fall back to sleep hoping to wake up next morning. Later I am awoken again, this time by the sound of screaming. But this screaming sounded like it was in my room, even though my girlfriend was home that night. So there was no one in my room to have screamed. After the scream, my entire body again becomes paralyzed, but this time it feels as if a steel cocoon has been wrapped around my body. As I try to move, it feels as if fingers wrap around my neck, choking me. Upon that moment, I see a scarlet face that looked like a withered old man. His face seemed to be carved from stone, and wrinkles and scars spread across his face. But these wrinkles were no ordinary wrinkles. They looked like they were placed by design and force. They were deep and set wide across his face in places where one does not usually see wrinkles. His eyes were hollow and black. I saw faces that looked as if they were beaten and mauled surrounding me in a circle, laughing and taunting me. They began whispering into my ears my greatest fears. I was barely able to speak and began to struggle, still unable to move. But the grip around my neck only became tighter as I saw an even more evil look begin to develop in this face. Barely able to speak, I was able to say, "I profess the blood of Christ." and my entire body was no longer paralyzed and my neck no longer felt as if it was being choked. I ran out of my room screaming and saw more wisps in my house. Running back into my room, I turned on the light to see red lines across my neck that looked like very long, slender fingers. Little to say I didn't sleep that night. My friend came over a few days later, and we began running some tests in my room. We used EVPs and white noise and found interesting results. I found that at least 10 demons had been sent by a leader with a mission. Since then, I have had little to no attacks other than seeing wisps in my house from time to time. But the chills have been getting more frequent lately, and I think they are coming for me once again. But I feel next time, they will be greater in number and power. I survived that night, but I fear I won't survive the next. Third story. My encounter with demonic forces. First post, first ever telling of my story. It has been over 20 years since these events have occurred. I did not feel I would ever tell my story until I came across this subreddit. I was reluctant to share what happened to me because I did not feel like arguing against doubt and disbelief and or defending my own sanity. Here I can tell you with less of these fears. This is what took place as I best remember. In the late 1980s, as a curious teen, I became fascinated with the occult. As a child growing up in a religious household, my first exposure of occult themes came from the Bible. I always strained to understand my beliefs concerning the teachings of the church, and especially struggled with my own faith in God. After learning that demons were former angels who had rebelled against God, were cast down to earth, and could interact with humans, I came to the conclusion that the best way to prove to myself that God existed was to see if demons existed. There was no internet back then to explore my questions and sate my curiosity. Knowledge of the occult was hard to come by and had to be searched for in libraries and bookstores. In time, I collected a small library of books about witchcraft and demonology. Looking back now, I realize how foolish I was. I didn't understand what I was getting myself into. Those books have since been destroyed after what happened to me. I began reading these books and actively trying to invite demons into my life. I read, out loud, long strings of demonic names out of the books. I would cast spells and draw symbols on my walls and on the floor. Nothing happened. I had a few strange dreams, but that wasn't proof of anything. Then one day I came across a paragraph that told me to get a full clove of garlic and stake it with a large iron nail to attract demonic power to a place. I did this and put the staked clove deep in my closet. The demons didn't come to me suddenly with a large fanfare. They came gradually, insidiously working their way into my life and psyche without me hardly noticing, until they were ready. Then they pounced and I was almost destroyed. I woke up more frequently with nightmares. I woke up sometimes listening intently because I could have sworn that what had awoken me was laughter or whispering. I passed these off as dreams. Sometime I woke up paralyzed for a few seconds. I passed this off as sleep paralysis. I woke up sometimes with all my sheets of the floor, far from the bed. I awoke some nights thinking, was my bed just moving? I passed this off as restless sleep. Then one night I woke up to watch my hand and arm shoot out from my side, grab the lamp on my night table, and throw it across the room with such force that I pulled my shoulder out and the lamp practically exploded against the opposite wall. I sat in the dark, cradling my arm, wondering how I could do such a thing out of a dead sleep. A few nights later, I did the same thing with a new lamp, with the same arm. I had to wear a sling to restrict movement of the shoulder. A few nights later, it happened one more time, but I didn't grab the lamp. I tore the sling right off my neck. I thought these things were very strange, but I still proceeded to invite the demons. I was still not convinced. I was a fool. I became irritable, and my family started to notice. I became lazy with my schoolwork, distant and withdrawn, and argumentative. My parents thought I might be on drugs. I was brought to a psychologist who tested me for them and diagnosed me with depression. I told no one what I was up to. Over time, the odd occurrences increased, but due to time and space and some embarrassment, I will leave some out. I will tell you that late one night I awoke to the full moon shining on my face through a window. I debated telling you this part because it sounds so strange, but I began growling at the moon. I remember not thinking as myself. My thoughts were basic and primal. I began growling more ferociously until I was practically foaming at the mouth and snapping at the moon like a rabid animal. I eventually snapped out of this and wondering what the hell I was doing. I didn't know yet, but at this point the demons were ready to pounce. They felt they had weakened me enough and worn down the walls between worlds within my room enough to extract my soul from my body. These next recollections are the most vivid in my mind. One night I awoke and felt very strange. I felt a jarring disjointedness. Then part of myself lifted out of my feet and then worked up my body until I was floating above the bed. It felt something like if you were to smoothly pull a piece of tape off of a flat surface. I was floating above my bed and I was looking down on myself. I tried to move but knew somehow that I would have had to learn how. After being amazed at what was happening, I then felt that something grabbed me by my feet, or lower part of myself, and started to violently shake me like a rag doll. I felt like a streamer being whipped back and forth. I saw one side of the room, then the other flash before my eyes. Something was trying to tear me away from a connection I still had to my body lying on the bed. I was terrified and I knew that if whatever was doing this to me succeeded, I would die. But the cord, I don't know what it was, tying me to my body was too strong. They could not break it. They gave up and let go, and I floated lazily up to the ceiling. I remember distinctly my cheek resting lightly against the ceiling of my room. I set my eyes on a specific imperfection on the ceiling I had studied many times from below, but it was now inches from my face. I remember thinking how it looked different from there. Suddenly I was in the bed, looking up at the ceiling where I just was. I was taking deep breaths like I needed air. I still felt strange and was paralyzed with fear. I felt my chest getting heavy. I took a deep breath, but the feeling stayed. Now I felt as if I was being pushed down, but did not feel any pressure in a specific place. It was as if some invisible weight had been draped over my torso and was getting heavier. I remember thinking that this is just a dream. There's no way any of this is happening. Then I heard a sound I will never forget as long as I live. I heard the sound of the bed creaking. I was sinking into the bed, and the sound of the bed warping under the increasing weight was real. This was really happening. In a frenzy of fear, I burst out of the bed and ran out of the room and the house. I went to my sister's house, who lived next door, and woke her up to let me in. I was wide-eyed and hyperventilating. She eventually calmed me down and began asking questions. I did not tell her about what I had been doing and told her I saw a ghost. She laughed it off and told me to stay the night if I wanted to. I stayed, but I did not sleep again that night. By the next day, I know what I had to do. So I went back to my house and up to my room. I quickly went into the closet, grabbed the clove of garlic with the staked nail, which was now black, and took it outside. My parents' house is made of stone, and I found the largest open space of wall with no windows and threw the clove against the stone. I swear the thing exploded against the wall like I had thrown a grenade. There was nothing left. I never found a piece of that clove or the nail. I threw all occult materials, objects, and books I had into the wood stove and burned them. I cleaned the symbols off the walls and furniture, and I never slept in that room again. Nothing like what I have told you ever happened to me after. I think whatever demonic and human it was had their one chance, but they failed, and they never bothered me again. So, do I now believe in God? Surprisingly, I'm still not sure that I do. But I do know that there are absolutely malicious entities in this world, and if you invite them into your life, they will gladly come in. Fourth story. I think I encountered a demon last night. Last night I had a nightmare that involved an entity that evoked a much stronger reaction from me than my usual dreams. What follows is a true story. The sky was overcast, and it was neither night nor day. It was a time outside normal conventions. There was no apparent source of light and no visible shadows. The flat, gray sky brought a dullness that blanketed the scenery. There was an entity in my front yard, tall and completely black, and the edges of his form appeared fuzzy, like a shadow. His proportions were relatively normal for his height, except his perfectly round head and huge, perfectly round, white eyes. His piercing eyes are what I remember most vividly about him. The entity started spitting fire onto my house from one of his arms, the flames sprouting seamlessly from his arm like a water hose. My front lawn had caught fire, but it had not yet reached my house. I started locking my door as it approached, and just as it was an arm's length, I got every lock closed. However, I watched them unlock themselves as the entity unlocked them from the outside. I tried calling for my parents, hysterically, to tell them something was getting into the house, but they dismissed me. This was the peak of my emotions. The fear of the intruder and the hopelessness my parents gave me drove me to tears. I sprinted to my basement, where there was a back door I could escape from, but I woke up. After waking, my fears subsided quickly, which is rather uncharacteristic. Even at my age, I tend to get paranoid at night still, probably because I spend too much time on this subreddit. But I chalked it up as a sign of maturity, checked the clock, and tried going back to sleep immediately. I was more angry that I was losing sleep, as I had had some trouble staying asleep earlier in the night. But the more I think about my instant relaxation, the more suspicious I become. Usually I would be wide-eyed, taking in every angle of my room, with my heart racing, especially for a dream so vivid and emotional. But after checking the clock, I didn't bother looking around my room. My eyes never adjusted to the darkness, and I just rolled over to go back to sleep. I genuinely think something lulled me into that relaxation, so that I would go back to sleep instead of surveying my room. It terrifies me to think that the entity entering my house in the dream could have allowed it access to my room. I had my suspicions that this was a demon, the emotions, my strange reactions and behavior, and the vivid memory of the entity. But later in the day I remembered what time it was when I awoke, 3 o'clock in the morning. There are superstitions that if one wakes up at 3 in the morning, then they are in the presence of a demonic entity. That was what convinced me I was visited by a demonic entity. Fifth story. I used to be a janitor at a public high school. I think I encountered a demon. I've been a janitor for my local high school for about 15 or so odd years. So when I say I've seen it all, I mean I've seen it all. One time, some sick bastard smeared shit on the bathroom walls in the girls' room. So when I got the call that there was an incident for me to clean in the library, I was prepared for the worst. Maybe some kid had puked everywhere. I didn't know, but I headed over with the proper supplies. As I approached the library, I smelled sulfur. I saw students running in a panic and heard the swarming of insects. What the hell? As I approached the library, I saw hundreds of flies coating the windows. I meant you couldn't see into the library through them. My curiosity outweighed my fear, and I pulled on the doors. I was hit with the smell of sulfur, like a punch to the face. The flies that covered the door didn't so much as react. A few students brushed past me, running for their lives. I saw in the center a young girl. She was in the fetal position, saying something to herself in a language I didn't recognize. I didn't recognize her, and I knew most students here. Well, enough to know him on sight anyway. She wore a tattered white dress, with matted black hair and the palest skin. She looked up at me. Her eyes were a piercing icy blue. A centipede crawled in one eye socket and out the other as she continued staring. Her breath smelled of rot and decay, like a dead or dying animal. I gulped and said, "Mississippi, you need to leave here. Leave." She repeated back in my own voice. What the hell was I looking at right now? I, against my best interest but unsure on how to approach this, put my hand on her shoulder. I instantly removed it as I felt something crawling underneath her skin. What looked like a locust crawled out of her mouth. Then she spoke. "I wouldn't do that." That time she spoke in my wife's voice. The smell of sulfur had gotten a lot stronger since I got closer to her. She stood, and a rattlesnake fell from between her legs, along with what I can only assume was urine. "What was this thing?" She giggled and said, "Do you like them?" I wasn't going to stick around. My paycheck isn't worth this. I ran to the doors, only to find it was locked. When I turned around, she was in my face. She forced me against the wall. "Ah, come now," she said. In an inhuman voice, "I wouldn't hurt a fly," she continued, maggots falling from mouth as she spoke. I shut my eyes and waited for the end, as this demon had me pinned to the wall. Next thing I knew, however, I was in an ambulance being interviewed by police. It had been 5 hours since I entered that library, but I had no memory of what happened after I tried, and failed to leave. The school is closed, due to what authorities called a severe insect infestation, and they blame it on some bullshit. I don't pay much attention to it. I know the truth. There was something not human in that library. I quit my job, and now I'm a manager at a shitty grocery store. Why am I telling you this? Well, today as I approached the store, I smelled sulfur and saw people running away. And insects. Lots of insects. 6th story. My terrifying encounter with a demon. When I was 14, I had a strange encounter that still puzzles me to this day. On the weekends, I'd sometimes go to my mother's place. My parents were divorced by this time. The house she lived in was converted into several small apartments. It was a creepy old farmhouse. The house was at least 150, maybe 200 years old. My mom told me off and on of strange sounds she'd been hearing and seeing things in the corner of her eyes, feeling of being watched. This one particular evening when I spent the night, I brought my N64 because my mom would go to bed early and I'd still be up for a few more hours. I still remember to this day what game I was playing. WWF No Mercy. I was sitting Indian style on the floor playing the story mode. I just finished a mission in the game and set down the controller to the left of me, behind me. Directly behind me was a recliner. I'll never forget what I saw next. I went to grab the controller and saw what appeared to be a hoof, like a horse next to the controller on the floor. Insects and blood was coming out of the sliver that separated the hoof. I thought to myself, how strange. I slowly glanced up and this demonic figure was staring back at me. It leaned down towards me. Its face got down in my face and grinned the most evil smile. The eyes black, face red. One-winged creature. Blood was dripping from its teeth. It was so surreal I immediately went into a panic attack and blacked out. I learned later it was the fight or flight response. Several seconds later I came to, laying on the floor, could barely move. The demonic figure in the chair laughing at me. It was as if my fear and energy had been sucked dry from me. I lost all strength. I did all I could to crawl to my mom's room and woke her up. After I woke her up, we talked, and she believed me. She told me she too had seen the same thing earlier that week, but didn't want to scare me. I don't know what to make of it, and still think of it to this day. I have no doubt demons and angels are real, And believe me, the last thing you ever want to encounter is a demon smiling in your face. My mother and her then boyfriend recall seeing this thing at my grandfather's house prior to moving to her farmhouse apartment. While they were laying in bed, my mother smelled sulfur, which then they'd seen this demonic thing walk into their bedroom, turned its head towards them, and let out a smile. It then disappeared. My grandfather acknowledged this thing was around, but it didn't bother him as he ignored it. He's passed on since then. It was an open secret within my family that something dwelled on the land. This only proved it. I don't care if you believe me or not, but when 3 people see the same thing on 2 separate occasions, and when 4 people acknowledge it, either we're all crazy or something was wrong with that old farmhouse and my grandfather's house. 7th story. I saw my first demon on the bus today. It followed me home. It was colder than the shady side of an iceberg. I shivered as the city bus lumbered its way toward me, sloshing and swaying along the snow-sodden street like a dinosaur in distress. I reveled in its warmth as soon as I stepped on. Immediately, something struck me as odd. A peculiar feeling swept over me, trickling down to the bottom of my boots. I wiped the fog from my glasses, then spotted a vacant seat at the back of the bus. It was the only seat available. I bumped my way through the bulky coated bodies, all the while feeling that something was dreadfully wrong. Then I saw it. The thing was gray-green, with heavy-set eyes dug deep into its football-shaped head. It was wearing a face mask. We all were, but I could still see its face, somehow. Its teeth were jagged like the remains of a bowl of Tostitos, lips like dental floss, almost non-existent, and zero nose whatsoever, as far as I could tell. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. I sat next to it. My stomach was tumbling like a dryer's final spin. My hands were shaking and wouldn't stop. I pulled out my phone and pretended to scroll through social media, but I wasn't. I was looking around to see if anyone else could see this thing for what it truly was. It had been a long day at work. Being a nurse in 2022 is pretty exhausting. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. It must be, right? Except, I could feel the thing eyeballing me. Its slippery mind worming its way into mine, like an anonymous hacker. It made me feel gross all over. The thing was leaning forward, studying me. I wanted to scream in rage and get away from it, but instead I sat quietly, hoping it would leave me alone, whatever it was. Then it spoke to me. "Cold enough for ya?" it asked. It sounded like it was chewing razor blades. Its voice was devoid of any emotion or inflection. The words sounded forced, almost robotic. I was too terrified to respond, so I simply nodded. Meanwhile, my eyes darted across the busy bus, stopping at an old Italian lady who was glaring at me. Her face suggested alarm. Her eyes told me she saw it too. This made me feel worse, but at least it reiterated what I already knew. I was sitting next to a demon. My ex-boyfriend would go on and on about these things. He says they're everywhere. He calls them lizard people and says they're running the world. I thought he was full of shit. I still do, to be honest. That's one of the reasons I broke up with him. Without realizing it, I was texting him. He's the only person I could tell. Heck, he's the only person who'd believe me. I had to shield my phone. The thing sitting next to me was trying to read my phone. I couldn't believe it. When it spoke again, I stifled my scream. "You're a nurse?" it asked, as if my scrubs didn't give this away.
Yes.
I said, staring out the window, praying for my stop to arrive, so I could get away from this monster. Unfortunately, the bus was crawling along King Street, hitting every stop along the way. I shifted in my seat. Even through my face mask, I could smell the thing. It smelled like pork chops, When you accidentally leave them out all weekend and the juices all turn bad and the flesh starts to rot. No wonder no one else sat next to it. Pu. I considered standing up and moving away, but the bus was rammed full of people, with more people getting on at every stop. I had to tough it out. 6 more stops to go. The Italian woman found my eyes again. Intense energy was seething from her sharp, harrowing eyes. Her eyes went from me to the monster, back to me, back to the monster. The Italian woman started speaking to me. Her voice was muddled due to her face mask, and she spoke Italian, so I couldn't make out what she was saying except Diablo. That sent chills down my spine. Meanwhile, the creature continued studying me with great interest, as though I was a zoo animal, or worse, a science experiment. Then it touched me. The bus hit a bump, and everyone jilted. The thing jumped from its seat, as did I, and touched my leg when we landed. It felt slimy and gross, even through my clothes. I now have a rash on my leg from where it handled me. Just my luck. 5 more stops to go. With immense effort, I forced the thing's hand off my leg. "Pardon me," it said in a slithery voice. Oh, how I wished it wouldn't speak. Without meaning to, I turned and looked it straight into its eyes. I shuddered. Its eyes were big black holes, like eternal darkness. Except something in the darkness was turning over and over somehow, like spinning marbles of madness. I pulled my eyes away. It bared its teeth. It knows. It knows I can see the thing for what it really is. For more stops. I wish this bus would get a move on. "You live around here?" the thing asked. I refused to answer. I smiled and nodded politely and looked toward the Italian lady for support. To my chagrin, she was standing up, bouncing her way toward the exit. She did, however, glance over at me, while the door groaned its way open, and to my surprise, she made the Ronnie James Dio devil horns while recited a mantra. The creature jolted, as though being struck with a hammer. The Italian lady ambled off the bus, shaking her head and muttering to herself as she went. I watched her get smaller and smaller as the bus rolled away. 3 more stops. "Weirdos everywhere," the demon thing said to me, its voice raising every hair on my body. Oh, how I wished it would shut its mouth. Its oval, toothy mouth. I was getting carsick. 2 more stops. The bus lumbered languidly along the slippery road. By now, my heart was threatening to leap out of my chest. Meanwhile, the thing next to me wouldn't shut up. "You take this bus often?" The more it tried to sound casual, the more I wanted to stick plugs in my ears. Worse, the thing was shimmering, as though projecting a fake hologram over its true form. I wondered what it looked like to everyone else. Everyone, that is, except the Italian lady. I hated it. "Oh, you know," was all I could say. My voice sounded far away, like a voice in a scary dream. 1 more stop. With my heart leaping from my chest and tears threatening to rain down my cheeks, I pushed the request stop button. Nothing happened. For a moment, I was consumed with panic. Then I realized someone else had beaten me to it. With incredible effort, I forced myself to stand. Then I beelined to the exit, pushing my way through the crowd. The bus pulled over and I got off. I breathed a sigh of relief the second my boots hit the ground. That is, until what happened next. The demon thing got off the bus as well. I shrieked. Instinct took over. I put my head down and started walking home, not bothering to look over my shoulder, seeing if it was following me. I already knew it was. I could hear it, crunching along the snow-clad sidewalk. I walked. It was bitter cold. The sidewalks were crusted in filthy slush and pieces of gnarly ice. Walking in this weather isn't easy, let me tell you, but I soldiered on. As I turned onto my street, I stole a quick glance over my shoulder. Sure enough, the creature was close behind me. For a moment, I froze dead in my tracks. Then, I picked up the pace and hurried toward my duplex and clumsily opened the door with shaky movements. As I was shutting the door, I saw it skulking me from across the street, wrapped in its warm winter coat and hat. I had to look away. The thing was revolting. Once inside my home, I tore off my coat and mittens and went for my phone. My ex texted back. He was more than intrigued. Apparently, he's been seeing these lizard people around town for more than a month. I called him, and we spoke for several minutes. He said he would stop by and have a look. That was over an hour ago. I haven't heard back from him, but the demon is still lurking outside my home. It's being creepy. It'll pace up and down the sidewalk, then stop directly in front of my house and stare. Then it'll walk away, only to return 10 minutes later and do the same thing again. It must be completely deranged, because it is downright freezing outside. I don't know what I'm going to do. I guess I'll finish this report in the morning. If I'm still alive, that is. Oh, I wish my ex was here with me. At least he's checking up on it. I hope. At some point in the night, the creature fled back to whatever hell it came from. Phew. Sleep came soon thereafter. I dreamed of monsters. When I awoke, my mind was quick to tell me how I'd imagined that thing on the bus. The demon. No rational, level-headed, hard-working person like myself would accept this to be true. Obviously, it's time to get ready for work. Before venturing out into the frigid February morning, I filled my thermos with piping hot coffee, as I always do. All the while, my mind wouldn't let go of that demon thing on the bus. The creature that followed me home. I peeked out my window, just in case. It was back. It was watching me. I ran to the washroom and regurgitated some toast and marmalade. It wasn't pretty, I'm not gonna lie. So, I'm putting this story out there in case something happens to me. I haven't heard back from my ex, which is weird. He was totally intrigued. What happened to him? I don't know. What I do know is this. A demon followed me home, and it's waiting for me. There's no way in hell I'm walking out that door. No way. I'll call in sick today. Then what? I'll call an Uber tomorrow. Then what? I don't know. I'll leave you with this. If someone tells you they saw something strange and unusual, listen to them. Because up until yesterday, I thought such things were hogwash. Now, I do not. When it's quiet, I can hear it whispering to me through the walls, directly into the attics of my mind. It's getting louder. Its words sound like madness. Maybe staying home is a bad idea. I honestly don't know what to do. If you don't hear back from me, send help. And remember, trust your eyes. There are monsters among us. We are not alone. 8th story. The House of Demons. Before all this happened, in the fall of 2016, I was a journalist best known for my articles on the paranormal or, rather, bullshit disguised as the paranormal. My career revolved around disproving various mysteries and conspiracy theories, exposing lies and attempting to turn people into skeptics. And, for the most part, the stories I investigated did turn out to be fake. I never imagined I'd encounter anything genuine. That is, until the House of Demons. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is just another story about an asshole skeptic who gets their comeuppance and becomes a believer. That isn't exactly untrue. But there is far more to this story than me learning my lesson the hard way. I had been contacted by a young woman whose father had recently been admitted to a mental hospital. The police had been called to his house after neighbors reported hearing screams, and found the poor man stumbling around his living room, covered in blood and screaming about things living in the walls. He had gnawed chunks of flesh from his arms and broken most of the furniture. The doctors believed he was suffering from psychosis, but his daughter, Kira, was convinced it was something else entirely. Something in that house terrified him, she told me over the phone. Whatever he saw in there, it drove him insane. Kira went on to explain the history of the house she had grown up in. Built in the late 1940s, it was rumored that the original owners had been devil worshippers. They had died in a mysterious accident, and since then, an endless string of paranormal events had been reported by anyone who lived there. Most of the stories Kira told me were pretty freaky, but, in my jaded opinion, too over the top to be believable. Like the old lady with glowing red eyes who chased people away from the property, screaming and waving a bloody knife. Or the man found dead in the bathtub, his throat slit and the words "he's coming" painted on the wall with his blood. Or the entire family that vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but patches of burnt rug in their living room. Kira had spoken to previous owners and documented anything she found noteworthy. "Tell me about your own experiences in the house," I urged. Kira explained that her own family had moved into the house when Kira was 7 years old, and that their life there had been fairly mellow, at least in comparison to some of the other stories. This, Kira believed, was because her parents were devout Catholics who prayed every day and had religious symbols on display in every room. Still, there were many unexplained sightings and noises, and an inexplicable dread that crept in on the darkest nights, a dread that nobody could shake off. After Kira's mother passed away, her father went a little crazy and began reporting strange events with alarming frequency. While Kira worried for his mental state, she had no doubt he was telling the truth. In the weeks leading up to his sudden breakdown, he had been complaining about something watching him at night and whispering horrible things in his ear. "I've read your work," said Kira. "I know you like to disprove paranormal claims, but this story is true. The people in my town, they call it the House of Demons." I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Ma'am, I'm very sorry about your father's condition, but I don't think dash. Please, Mrs. Johnston, everyone thinks my dad is insane. I want people to know what really happened in there. How do you know he'll even talk to me?" "He will. Believe me." And so, a week later, I kissed my husband and 4-year-old daughter goodbye before boarding an airplane that would take me from my home in Vancouver to Ontario. After landing in the city, I picked up a rental car and drove out to the small town where the dreaded House of Demons stood. Kira met me at a local coffee shop. She was a petite blonde with mascara-heavy blue eyes, dressed in a black sleeveless turtleneck and faded jeans. She stood up as soon as I walked in. "Amelia Johnston?" "Yes." I extended my hand, and she shook it. "It's nice to meet you." She smiled. "Thank you for coming." Over coffee, she gave me an update on her father, a 63-year-old man named Edwin Montgomery. They've put him on antipsychotic drugs, but he's still pretty messed up. Still, he's agreed to talk to you. I still didn't believe I was really dealing with a haunted house case, but nonetheless, I felt bad for Kira. She was obviously shaken about her father and what he might have gone through. Given his state, I wasn't so sure interviewing him would be a good idea, but I couldn't turn back now. After finishing our coffees and paying the bill, Kira and I drove out to the facility where Edwin was being held. A nurse escorted us to his room, and what I saw left me nearly speechless. Edwin Montgomery was strapped to his bed, his arms heavily bandaged. His disheveled white hair had the texture of dry straw, and his blue eyes, sunken deep within the bony hollows of his sockets, held the glazed, haunted look of a soldier returning from war. A man who had literally seen hell. "Daddy?" Kira spoke very quietly, as if any sudden noise would send her father off the deep end. This is Amelia Johnston, that journalist I was telling you about. She wants to talk to you." Very slowly, Edwin turned his head and looked right at me, or rather, past me, at the faded green wall. His chapped, bluish lips moved, forming words without a voice. I sat in the chair next to his bed and stared at him for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. Edwin just kept staring at me. Kira stood off to the side, biting her lip. Finally, I broke the silence myself. "Edwin, can you tell me what happened? About why you were sent here?" He blinked, and I knew I had gotten through to him. It's nice to meet you," he rasped. "You too. They probably told you I'm crazy, but it isn't true." "I don't think you're crazy," I lied, uncapping my pen, "but I am curious about what happened." Edwin sighed, closing his eyes. "That house, something horrible lives there. I don't know what it is, nor do I particularly want to, but it tried to kill me. And if I go back there, it will finish the job." Something about the tired resignation in those words gave me the chills. I hated feeling afraid on the job, but I couldn't help it. Although I'd encountered many weirdos throughout my career, this old man wasn't like the rest. I didn't know what to make of him. "What's going to kill you, Edwin?" I heard the door slam shut as Kira walked out. I didn't blame her for not wanting to listen. If it were my dad, I'd feel the same. Edwin let out another long sigh. "Well, there is more than one monster in that place. But the one that drove me to such extremes, he is the one that has tormented me the most. He is the one who killed my wife." "Didn't your wife die of a stroke?" "That's what the doctors said. But that's not what really happened. He killed her." I rested a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Who are you talking about, Edwin?" "The man with the orange eyes." Now this was getting interested. "The man with the orange eyes," I repeated, slowly. Edwin nodded. He had gone pale, his body shaking against the restraints. "I've been seeing him every day since we moved in. He's evil. A monster. He killed my wife, and he's going to kill me too." "Who is this man? A ghost?" "I don't know what he is, but he certainly isn't human." I still can't say I believe this was anything paranormal, but every word Edwin spoke sent further shivers down my spine. Is he a demon? Perhaps. That place is known as the House of Demons after all. "Did you know about the history of the house before you moved in?" Edwin shook his head rapidly. "No. Well, perhaps a little, but I didn't believe a word of it. I was a skeptic, just as you appear to be." I stared down at my notebook. I hadn't written a thing. I was so captured by Edwin's story. "How could you tell?" He smiled, ever so slightly. "I just could." I shook my head, swallowing my discomfort. "Well, anyway, you didn't know about the stories?" "Not much, and I didn't believe them anyway. I moved my family in without a second thought, and for a while, things were okay. But I began seeing things." He paused for a breath, then continued. "Terrible things. I had the most awful of dreams and visions. People being killed in the most brutal of fashions. Demon creatures lurking in the corners. The floor breaking apart and revealing a portal to hell. The man with the orange eyes. He isn't so much a man as he is a shadow. Just a black silhouette, shaped like a man, with these glowing orange orbs in his face. They are like twin flames, and they never seem to dim. I have seen him every day for the past 30-something years. He torments me. I never told the wife or kids. I didn't want to frighten them. Instead, I hung crosses on the walls and hoped the grace of God would protect us. And to an extent, it did. But the man with orange eyes never left. I would wake up in the middle of the night and find him standing over the bed, watching my wife and I sleep. I'd pull into the driveway in the evening and see him at a window. He never spoke to me directly, but sometimes I could hear a deep, raspy voice in my head. It would say terrible things. Like what? I asked. Edwin began shaking even harder. He would tell me to kill myself, to kill my family. He told me about all the horrible things he had done to those who had lived in the house before. He wanted to drive me mad. I spent every day fighting him. Once he realized I wouldn't be so easy to break, he turned on my wife. It only took her 2 years to fall. He drained the life out of her. After Prudence's death, I began hearing scratching sounds in the walls. I thought they might be rats, but that was before the whispers started, and the screams, and the blood. Excuse me, blood? Yes, the walls themselves would bleed. Okay, that was freaky. I glanced behind me at the closed door, wondering if Kira was listening, before turning my attention back to Edwin. What else can you tell me? The man with the orange eyes was angry, said Edwin. He had wanted me to die first, not Prudence. He swore he would make my demise as painful as possible. Edwin's eyes slipped away from me and went to his bandaged arms. He wanted my blood. He wanted me to suffer. On the day I was admitted to this place, he did something, I don't know what, but it felt as if I had insects crawling beneath my skin. That's why I tore up my arms. The man with the orange eyes was laughing at me. It was terrible. And now, he wants to finish the job. I just know it. I'll never be free. Never. Edwin went still of a sudden, closing his eyes. For a moment, I feared he was dead, but the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest proved otherwise. I left the room, passing a white-faced and trembling Kira in the hall. I'll call you later, I mumbled, and fled the hospital. Halfway to my hotel, I took a turn and began driving down the road leading to the House of Demons. Why? Well, the most stubborn part of me still didn't believe Edwin's story, dismissing it as the ramblings of a senile old man, and I wanted to see the house for myself. The House of Demons turned out to be a towering brick structure with a lopsided roof and butter-yellow door. I pulled up out front and sat there for a moment, going over what Edwin had told me again and again. Then, without thinking, I exited the car and went to stand in the overgrown front lawn. I titled my head back and stared up at a darkened window, remembering Edwin's account of seeing the man with orange eyes watching him from the other side of the class. I didn't expect to see anything, but my eyes were drawn to that window. It took the shrill ringing of my phone to finally snap me out of it. Hello? Mrs. Johnston. It was Kira, and she sounded freaked. Mrs. Johnston, what happened? Are you okay? I'm fine, Kira. Your dad's story just spooked me a bit. Where are you now? Well, I'm kind of at the house. You're what? She shrieked, so shrilly I had to pull the phone away from my ear to avoid being deafened. Mrs. Johnston, do you have any idea how dangerous that place is? Especially with no one home? Kira, I dash. I'm on my way. Stay put. 5 minutes later, Kira's car appeared. She parked it behind mine and rushed over to me, panting, her eyes wild and wet. Jesus, I gasped. Are you okay? Daddy was so upset after you left. He was screaming and rambling. The nurse had to sedate him. I winced. I'm so sorry. No, it wasn't your fault. It was mine. I should never have called you. Shit, I'm a mess. It's just... She broke down in heaving sobs, and I awkwardly put my arms around her. Comforting others has never been my strong suit, particularly if it's a stranger. Kira buried her face in my chest, her body trembling against mine. Maybe we should get out of here, I said. peering at the house over the top of Kira's head. I was not expecting to see two floating orange orbs in the window. "Kira," I hissed. "Don't look, okay?"
What?
"Don't look. Follow me." I led her back to my rental car and drove off. When I looked back, the eyes were gone, but the sky above the house seemed darker somehow, as if reflecting a coming storm. I dropped Kira off at her own house and went to my hotel. I wrote out a rough draft for an article on the House of Demons, but could barely concentrate. The project wasn't going anywhere, and I returned home in defeat. A month later, Kira emailed me to tell me that her father had died. He killed himself. Somehow, he broke the restraints. He clawed his own eyes out and slit his own throat with a shard of glass from the broken window. I think he wanted to die on his own terms, before the man with orange eyes could get him. I emailed her back, expressing my condolences, but never got a response. I couldn't stop thinking about that house, and decided to return to that town, to see that place one last time. The House of Demons stood abandoned when I arrived. Before leaving, I had tracked down the realtor trying to sell the house. No luck, which didn't surprise me, and called her, asking if she would let me in. I explained I was a journalist trying to write a piece on the house. "Will you let me in? I just want to have a quick look around." The woman sounded hesitant, but agreed. I met her at the house, greeting her politely. She was an older woman with platinum blonde hair, dressed in a navy blue suit. "I'm Norma Shaw. It's nice to meet you." She nervous tired, and I felt bad for her. "You don't have to come in with me," I said. "Nonsense. I can't let you go in that place alone." She fished a set of keys out of her purse. "How long will you need?" "Not too long," I assured her. "Just a quick look around." "Okay, then." Mrs. Shaw gave a painful grin. "Let's go." The interior of the house was dark and musty, not any different from your average old, abandoned dwelling. I felt no oppressive atmosphere, no creeping sensation of being watched. Nothing to justify why this place was called the House of Demons. But remembering Edwin's story and how he had so brutally killed himself, I tried to keep an open mind. Mrs. Shaw led me from room to room, and I only lingered long enough to jot down some notes and take a quick look around. I saw nothing noteworthy, but on the way back down the upstairs hall, I paused to look at painting hanging on the wall, Mrs. Shaw several steps ahead. When I turned, she was out of sight. "Mrs. Shaw?" I called, my voice echoing loudly in the empty space. "Hello?" No answer. I hurried in the direction she'd been going, turning a corner and finding her purse lying on the floor. The contents spilled out and scattered around like debris from a train wreck. Surrounding the mess was a pool of dark, coppery-smelling liquid. Blood. "Holy tea," I whispered. My head was spinning. I didn't want to believe this was happening. A wet thunk from behind me made me jump about 10 feet into the air and spin around. Mrs. Shaw's head had fallen behind me. Her eyes were wide, her face still ossified in an expression of pure horror. The stump of her neck was ragged and bloody, with about 2 inches of spine visible. The pearl-white bone had been snapped off, leaving a jagged edge. I ran, dropping my notebook and pen along the way. I didn't really care where I ended up, as long as I was far away from that terrible scene. I was going so fast that when a gnarled hand twisted itself into my hair, my scalp was nearly torn off. I screamed and thrashed as something dragged me down the stairs. The creature was snarling and hissing in a deep, guttural voice as it threw open the basement door Mrs. Shaw had shown me earlier and threw me down. I flew through the cold, musty air and hit the concrete floor so hard it's a wonder every bone in my body didn't shatter. Groaning in pain, I rolled over just in time to see the door slam shut and hear something scuttled away. Adrenaline drowned out the pain of my injuries, and I managed to stand up. As I fumbled around for a light switch, and my hand touched something soft and fleshy. "Oh, Jesus, no," I muttered. A frayed string brushed my face, and I pulled on it. A dim yellow light bulb flickered to life. I screamed. Kira, or at least, what had once been her. She was dead, her skin purple, black, and blue with decay. The top of her head had been caved in, creating a gory cavern of blood, skin, bone, and brain matter. She had been pinned to the wall by what looked like a rusty, blood-stained railroad spike, hammered right through her chest. "Oh, my God," I muttered, backing up in shock. "Oh, my God. Oh, my God." Kira's body twitched. Her head jerked up, and she looked right at me. Her eyes were empty sockets, her once pretty face a bloated mess of rotting flesh and wriggling white maggots. She opened her mouth, her jaw cracking grotesquely as she did so, and let out a screech. "No," I wailed, tripping in my high-heeled pumps and landing flat on my ass. Kira let out another scream, and to this day, I can't truly describe the sound. The best thing I can compare it to is the wail of a banshee, mixed with the braying of a goat and radio static. Through the overwhelming horror taking over my mind, I suddenly remembered. I still had my purse, and in it was my phone. The terrible screams filled my ears as I crawled across the dirty concrete floor and snatched up the phone. The screen was cracked, but the device still worked. With shaking fingers, I dialed 911. "Please," I gasped as soon as the operator picked up. "Send help. What's your emergency? I'm hurt, and there's something here. Please, just hurry." I gave the woman my address, and she assured me that help was on the way. As I lay on my back, in pain, waiting for someone to come and rescue me, Kira's screams began morphing into words. "You shouldn't have come." She didn't have to tell me twice. Gradually, I became aware of how hot the basement was getting. I could faintly smell smoke, and the realization that the house was on fire hit me with the force of a nuclear blast. I looked up at Kira's impaled body, saw crackling orange flames. Kira's body was melting, the skin sloughing off her bones. Black smoke poured from her mouth and ears. Then, suddenly, she exploded into a swarm of fat black flies. The combination of heat, pain, and the maniacal buzzing of 1,000 or so flies was maddening. I curled into the fetal position, hands over my ears, and screamed. The next thing I remember is one of the basement windows breaking and a fireman carrying me out. "Mother of God, miss, what did they do to you?" he gasped. I was placed in the back of an ambulance, and before the doors were shut, I caught a glimpse of the house going up in flames, as if the very gates of hell had opened up inside. I was airlifted back to Vancouver, where I spent 5 weeks in the hospital. I had broken bones, bruises, scrapes, gashes, burns, and even some internal bleeding. The house of demons burned down to nothing but ash. The cause of the fire could not be determined. After returning home in a wheelchair, still all bandaged up, I began to remember things about my encounter. The twisted, goblin-like appearance of the creature that dragged me to the basement. The glowing orange eyes that glared maliciously at me from the dark just before the fire began. The agonized screams and wails of tortured souls, combining with Kira's own cries, creating a cacophony of terror that nearly crippled me. Needless to say, I didn't end up writing about the House of Demons. I can't explain what happened, and that's the hardest part. Not knowing. Now I can honestly say I believe in the paranormal. and it terrifies me. I've seen for myself the horrors that lurk in the shadows, and I can never forget. Especially after the phone call I received last week. The call came from an unknown number. I picked it up, expecting to hear "sorry, wrong number." Instead, there was a strange shuffling noise and a weak, reedy voice whispering, "Please, help. Excuse me. Who is this? Please, help." Then the line went dead. The voice sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. Until that night, as I got ready for bed. It had been Kira. She barely sounded like herself, but it had definitely been her. I don't know where Kira is now, and I think it best for my sanity that I never found out. But wherever it is, I sense that it's even worse than the House of Demons. I just wish there was something I could do. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.